The roar of 350 Harley-Davidsons shaking the ground is enough to terrify any man. When the Hells Angels surrounded Alexander's rusty Nevada garage, he thought his life was over. All because he shared his meager dinner with a starving, bleeding girl left for dead in the desert. The Mojave Desert does not forgive, and it certainly does not forget. In the forgotten outskirts of Beatty, Nevada, the heat radiates off the cracked asphalt like a physical weight. Here sits Alexander Carter's auto repair shop, a crumbling monument to a life spent underneath the chassis of dying sedans. Alexander, at 54, looked like the landscape he inhabited, weathered, deeply lined, and coated in a permanent layer of grease and dust. He was a poor mechanic, barely scraping together enough cash to keep the lights on and the property taxes paid. His meals usually consisted of stale bread and whatever canned soup was on sale at the local dollar store. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when the wind began to howl, kicking up blinding dust storms that forced the few locals to board up their windows. Alexander was closing the rusted chain-link gates of his lot, his joints aching from a 10-hour shift replacing a transmission on an old Ford pickup. The neon sign above his office sputtered, casting an eerie intermittent red glow over the salvage yard. As he turned the padlock, he heard it, a faint muffled whimper. At first Alexander dismissed it as the wind whistling through the hollow shells of wrecked cars, but the sound came again, followed by the metallic clatter of a hubcap hitting the dirt. Alexander reached into his heavy canvas jacket, wrapping his calloused hand around the heavy steel wrench he always kept for protection. "Who's there?" His voice was gravelly, worn out by years of cheap tobacco and isolation. He moved cautiously toward a mountain of scrapped tires near the back fence. The red neon light flickered, illuminating a small, crumpled shape wedged between the rusted-out Chevrolet and the stack of pallets. It wasn't an animal. It was a girl. Alexander dropped his wrench. She couldn't have been older than 20. Her clothes were torn to rags, stiff with dried mud and dark, oxidized blood. Her blonde hair was matted to her forehead, and her face was heavily bruised, one eye completely swollen shut. She was trembling violently, her lips cracked and blue despite the lingering heat of the day. "Dear God," Alexander whispered, falling to his knees. As he reached out to touch her shoulder, she flinched, curling into a tight ball, her good eye darting wildly in terror. She threw her hands over her head, a defensive posture of someone who had endured unspeakable cruelty. "Don't," she croaked, her voice barely a rasp. "Please, no more." "I'm not going to hurt you," Alexander said, keeping his hands visible, speaking in the low, steady tone he used to calm stray dogs. "I'm Alexander. This is my shop. You're safe here." How? He noticed the deep lacerations on her arms and the unnatural angle of her left wrist. She was severely malnourished, her collarbones protruding sharply beneath her ruined shirt. Alexander knew he had to get her to a hospital, but the nearest emergency room was nearly 50 miles away, and his truck was currently up on cinder blocks. "I need to call the police," Alexander said, reaching for his flip phone. "No." The girl lunged with a sudden, desperate burst of adrenaline, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "No cops. Please. They have people everywhere. If the cops come, they'll find me. They'll kill me. And they'll kill you." The sheer, unadulterated terror in her eye stopped Alexander cold. He had lived off the grid long enough to know that out in the desert there were predators that wore expensive suits and drove black SUVs. Predators the law couldn't always touch. "All right," Alexander said softly, putting the phone away. "No cops. But you can't stay out here. You'll freeze when the sun goes down." He gently scooped her up. She was frighteningly light, feeling like a bundle of fragile twigs in his arms. He carried her into his cluttered office, laying her down on the old, broken-down leather sofa he used for afternoon naps. Alexander's medical supplies were primitive. He fetched his first aid kit, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, some clean shop rags, and a bucket of warm water. For the next 2 hours he painstakingly cleaned her wounds, applying rudimentary bandages. He fashioned a makeshift splint for her broken wrist, using a piece of smooth scrap wood and duct tape. Through it all, she drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering feverish, disjointed sentences about her basement and running in the dark. When she finally stabilized, Alexander went to his hot plate. He opened his last can of Campbell's chicken noodle soup, heated it up, and brought it to her. "Here," he coaxed gently, propping her head up. "You need to eat." She ate like a starved animal, nearly choking on the broth in her desperation. Alexander had to gently pull the bowl away to pace her. "Slow down, kid. It's not going anywhere." When she finished, she sank back into the leather cushions, a breathing evening out. "What's your name?" Alexander asked quietly. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the garage. "Fiona," she finally whispered. "Well, Fiona," Alexander sighed, looking around at his meager surroundings. "I don't have much, but what I have, I'll share. You rest now." He covered her with a heavy, clean wool blanket and sat in the creaky office chair by the door, a loaded shotgun resting across his lap. He didn't sleep a wink that night, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside the window, wondering what kind of monsters were hunting the fragile girl sleeping on his couch. Days bled into weeks, and Fiona became the ghost haunting Alexander's garage. The Nevada sun rose and fell, baking the tin roof of the shop. But inside, a quiet rhythm established itself. Alexander cleared out a small, windowless storage room in the back, dragging in a cot and a space heater to create a hidden sanctuary for her. She was terrified of being seen. If a customer pulled into the lot for an oil change or a flat tire, Fiona would silently vanish into the back room, locking the heavy steel door from the inside until Alexander gave the all-clear, not two slow taps, followed by 3 quick ones. Keeping her alive became Alexander's sole purpose, but it was a heavy burden on a man who already had nothing. Fiona needed medicine. The wounds on her legs were prone to infection, and her fever spiked dangerously during the first few nights. Alexander emptied his meager savings jar, $82 in crumpled bills and quarters, and drove to the pharmacy in the next town over, buying over-the-counter antibiotics, bandages, and nutrient-rich drinks. Food became the biggest issue. Alexander was used to eating 1 small meal a day, but Fiona's malnourished body was crying out for calories. To ensure she had enough, Alexander began skipping his own meals. He told her he had already eaten while he worked under the cars, but the truth was his stomach gnawed at him endlessly. He took on extra brutal labor, driving his patched-up tow truck into the deep desert to haul heavy, worthless scrap metal, selling it for pennies just to buy her fresh fruit, eggs, and bread. Despite the hardship, a profound bond formed between the two outcasts. As Fiona's strength slowly returned, so did a spark of life in her eyes. In the quiet hours of the night, when the garage was locked and the neon sign was switched off, she would sit on an overturned bucket while Alexander tinkered with engines. "You don't have to do this for me, Alexander," she said one evening, watching him split a single can of baked beans onto 2 plates, giving her the larger portion. "Nonsense," Alexander grunted, wiping grease from his hands. "Our garage needs a mascot. Besides, you're the only one around here who listens to my old stories without complaining." She smiled, a genuine, albeit fragile, expression. She began helping out where she could, organizing his scattered tools, sweeping the concrete floors, and brewing the bitter black coffee they both drank. Yet she never spoke of her past. She never explained who she was running from. Alexander never pushed. He knew that some demons needed to be left in the dark until the victim was strong enough to face them. However, the outside world was closing in. It started on a blistering Thursday afternoon. Alexander was underneath a Chrysler when he heard the heavy crunch of gravel. He rolled out on his creeper to see a massive, pristine black Cadillac Escalade idling in his lot. It looked entirely out of place among the rust and ruin of Batty. 2 men stepped out. They wore expensive tailored suits that hid the distinct bulge of shoulder holsters. They wore dark sunglasses and moved with the silent, predatory grace of men who hurt people for a living. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other slightly smaller but with a jagged scar running down his jawline. "Can I help you fellas?" Alexander asked, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag, trying to keep his heart rate steady. He subtly positioned himself between the men and the garage door. "We're looking for someone," the tall man said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any accent, completely terrifying. He pulled a glossy photograph from his inside pocket and held it out. A girl, blonde, blue eyes, about 20 years old. She might be injured. Alexander looked at the photograph. It was Fiona, though she looked healthier, her hair styled, wearing an expensive dress. Alexander's face remained a mask of dull indifference. "Can't say that I have. We don't get many young girls out this way. Mostly just truckers and locals." The scarred man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the dark, open bay doors of the garage. "You sure about that, old man?" "There's a substantial reward for anyone who points us in the right direction, and severe penalties for anyone hiding her." Alexander spat a wad of tobacco onto the dirt. "Look around, buddy. I ain't got the space to hide a stray cat, let alone a girl. Try the motel down by the highway." The tall man stared at Alexander for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, he tucked the photo away. "If you see her, call the number on this card. It would be in your best interest." He flicked a sleek black business card onto the hood of a nearby car. They got back into the Escalade and drove away, the tinted windows hiding their departure. Alexander stood frozen until the dust settled. He immediately closed the bay doors, locked them, and rushed to the back room. He knocked the code. The door opened, revealing a trembling Fiona. She had heard everything. "They found me," she sobbed, backing into the corner of the dark room. "Frank and Vince. They're my father's enemies. They took me to use as leverage. Alexander, you have to let me go. They'll kill you." "I ain't letting you go anywhere," Alexander said fiercely, grabbing her by the shoulders. "They bought my lie. They're gone. You're safe here." But they weren't safe. 2 days later, the local radio station in the garage interrupted a classic rock song with a bizarre traffic update. The DJ sounded bewildered. "Folks, if you're traveling on Interstate 95 heading north toward Beatty, you might want to pull over. Highway Patrol is reporting a massive convoy blocking all northbound lanes. We're talking hundreds of motorcycles. Authorities are identifying them as members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, coming in from multiple charters in California and Nevada. They are moving together, and they seem to have a specific destination in mind." Alexander stared at the radio. 350 bikers. The Hells Angels. Fiona stood in the doorway of the back room, her face completely drained of color. She looked at Alexander, tears welling in her eyes, a strange mix of absolute terror and overwhelming realization washing over her features. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling, "they aren't here for the cartel." Before Alexander could ask what she meant, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. It started as a low, distant hum like an approaching earthquake. Within minutes, the hum turned into a deafening, thunderous roar that drowned out the wind and rattled the dirty windows of the garage. Alexander looked out the front window. A sea of leather, chrome, and denim was pouring off the highway, turning onto the dirt road that led directly to his shop. The Hells Angels had arrived. The dust cloud eclipsed the Nevada sun, casting a twilight pall over the scrapyard. The deafening thunder of 350 heavy V-twin engines vibrated through the concrete floor, shaking the dusty tools right off Alexander's pegboard. It was a mechanical stampede, a tidal wave of chrome, black leather, and burning rubber surging into the desolate lot. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pushed Fiona back into the shadows of the small storage room. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice remarkably steady despite the terror pooling in his gut. "Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Lock the deadbolt." "My Alexander, no!" Fiona grabbed his canvas jacket, her knuckles white. "You don't understand who they are. You can't fight them. I'm not going to let anyone take you, kid, Alexander replied softly, prying her fingers away. He closed the heavy steel door and listened for the solid clack of the lock. Alexander turned toward his office desk. From beneath the bottom drawer he pulled out a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun, a relic from his father's time. He racked a shell into the chamber, a loud, unforgiving sound that was instantly drowned out by the chaos outside. He stepped out into the blinding afternoon heat. The front lot was entirely consumed by motorcycles. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, idling with a menacing, guttural growl that resonated in Alexander's teeth. The riders wore heavy denim and black leather cuts, adorned with the infamous winged death's head patch of the Hells Angels. They were enormous men, battle-scarred and heavily armed, their faces obscured by dark sunglasses and bandanas. The engines shut off in unison. The sudden silence that fell over the desert was infinitely more terrifying than the noise. From the center of the pack, a massive man dismounted his custom Harley-Davidson Road King. He was easily 6'4", built like a freight train with a long graying beard that rested against his leather vest. The president patch over his heart marked him as the leader of the Nevada Charter. His eyes, hard and cold as chipped flint, locked onto Alexander. Alexander raised the shotgun, resting the butt against his hip, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "Property's closed," he yelled, his gravelly voice echoing across the silent yard. "Turn your bikes around and ride out." Now, the giant biker didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his heavy boots. "Put the gun down, old man. We aren't here for your scrap metal." "I don't care what you're here for," Alexander spat, shifting his stance. "You're trespassing. We're looking for a girl," the biker growled, his deep voice carrying an undeniable authority. "Blonde, blue eyes, taken from Vegas 3 weeks ago. We know she was out this way." Alexander felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. Frank and Vince, the men in the suits, had been terrifying in a clinical, corporate way. This army of outlaws was a force of nature. "I already told the guys in the suits." Alexander lied smoothly, his face an impenetrable mask of weathered wrinkles. "Nobody's here. Now back off." The biker narrowed his eyes. He raised a massive gloved hand, and half a dozen men behind him stepped off their bikes, reaching into their jackets. The tension was a physical weight in the air, a powder keg, a millisecond away from a spark. Alexander knew he was going to die. He mentally made his peace with it, hoping the heavy steel door would buy Fiona enough time to find another way out. "I won't ask again," the president said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Where is she?" "Right here." The voice was tiny, fragile, but it cut through the heavy silence like a razor blade. Alexander whipped his head around. Fiona was standing in the doorway of the garage. She had unlocked the door. She looked terrified, her hand shaking as she gripped the door frame, but she stood tall. Alexander moved to shield her. "Get back inside," he hissed. But Fiona didn't retreat. She stepped entirely out of the shadows, the brutal Nevada sun illuminating the fading bruises on her face and the makeshift splint on her arm. The president of the Hells Angels froze. The hard, murderous intent vanished from his eyes, replaced by a shock so profound it made him stagger backward a half-step. "Fiona," he choked out, his booming voice suddenly cracking. "Uncle Tommy," she sobbed. The giant man let out a sound that was half roar, half sob. He crossed the distance between them in 3 massive strides, dropping to his knees on the filthy concrete before her. He wrapped his massive tattooed arms around her frail body, burying his face in her shoulder as she wept uncontrollably into his leather vest. Alexander slowly lowered the shotgun, utterly bewildered. "I thought they killed you," Tommy whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "God, we thought they killed you." The twist hit Alexander like a physical blow. Fiona wasn't just some random girl caught in a cartel war. She was MC royalty. Tommy pulled back, gently holding Fiona's face in his huge hands, inspecting the bruises and cuts. His sorrow instantly morphed into a terrifying, white-hot rage. He looked up at Alexander, his eyes burning. Who did this to her? Was it him? No, Fiona screamed, stepping between them. No, Uncle Tommy. Alexander saved me. They dumped me in the desert to die. He found me. He hid me. He gave up his own food to keep me alive. He protected me from Frank. The name Frank rippled through the sea of bikers like an electric shock. Jawlines tightened, hands drifted toward weapons. Tommy slowly stood up, towering over Alexander. The menacing aura returned, but this time it wasn't directed at the mechanic. The giant biker looked at Alexander's dirty clothes, his sunken cheeks from weeks of starvation, and the heavy shotgun still gripped in his hands. Without a word, the president of the Hells Angels reached out and enveloped Alexander in a crushing, bone-rattling embrace. "You saved my brother's little girl," Tommy rumbled, his voice thick with emotion. "My brother was the founder of this charter. When that syndicate took her to keep us from interfering in their Vegas operations, they ripped our heart out. You kept it beating." Alexander, stiff and uncomfortable with the display of affection, gently patted the giant man's back. She needed help. It was just the right thing to do. Tommy stepped back, a dangerous, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Well, Alexander, the right thing is about to be rewarded, and the wrong thing is about to be corrected." The reunion was short-lived. A scout from the edge of the property suddenly jogged up to Tommy, whispering urgently in his ear, "President, 2 black Escalades approaching fast from the highway. And sont one of show them the do." Fiona gasped, her eyes widening in terror. "It's them. It's Frank. They must have figured out you lied to them, Alexander." Alexander's grip on his shotgun tightened, but Tommy simply held up a hand, his face perfectly calm. "Brothers," Tommy addressed the 350 men in the yard. "It seems the garbage has decided to deliver itself." What happened next was a masterpiece of orchestrated chaos. At Tommy's command, the massive army of bikers moved with terrifying efficiency. They didn't flee, they melted into the environment. Within 3 minutes, hundreds of motorcycles were pushed behind the towering mountains of scrap metal, behind the garage, and into the deep ravines bordering the property. The bikers themselves vanished into the shadows, taking up positions behind rusted sedans, inside hollowed-out buses, and upon the roof of the shop. When the dust settled, the yard looked exactly as it had an hour ago, empty, quiet, and desolate. "Alexander," Tommy said quietly, handing him a heavy Colt 45 from his waistband. "You stand right where you were. Fiona, get in the back room. Let them think they have the upper hand." Alexander stood alone in the center of his lot, the shotgun resting by his side. The crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of the cartel. The 2 pristine black Escalades tore into the yard, kicking up a storm of dirt before slamming on their brakes. The doors flew open and 8 men poured out. They were heavily armed with automatic rifles, wearing tactical vests over their expensive clothes. Frank, the tall man in the tailored suit, stepped out last, a smug, cruel smile on his face. "You lied to us, old man," Frank said, racking the bolt of his rifle. "We checked the security footage from the gas station in town. You bought women's antibiotics and bandages 3 days ago. Bring her out, or we burn this garbage dump to the ground with you inside it." Alexander stood his ground, casually spitting a wad of tobacco into the dirt. "I told you, property's closed." Frank let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You think that antique shotgun is going to stop 8 of us? You're a fool, mechanic. Kill him and tear the place apart." The men raised their rifles. Kang. Kang, the sharp sound of a heavy wrench hitting a steel pipe echoed across the yard. Frank paused, looking around. Suddenly the rusted hood of a nearby Ford pickup flew open, and a massive biker stood up, a heavy revolver leveled at Frank's men. Before Frank could react, the silence of the desert was shattered. Men stepped out from behind every pile of tires, every scrapped chassis, and every shadowed corner of the garage. The roof of the shop was lined with men holding high-powered rifles. 350 Hells Angels emerged from the rust and the dust, forming an impenetrable, heavily armed circle around the 8 cartel men. Frank's arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of absolute paralyzing horror. He looked around wildly, realizing he'd just driven his men into a slaughterhouse. His mercenaries, seeing the sheer number of heavily armed bikers surrounding them, slowly, deliberately lowered their weapons, dropping them into the dirt. Tommy parted the sea of his men, stepping into the circle. He walked right up to Frank, the size difference making the cartel boss look like a frightened child. "You made a mistake, Frank," Tommy said, his voice low and vibrating with malice. "You thought you were taking leverage, but all you did was ring the dinner bell." "Tommy, listen," Frank stammered, his polished demeanor completely shattering, his hands trembling violently. "We can make a deal. Name your price. We have money." Tommy didn't let him finish. He delivered a brutal, shattering backhand across Frank's face, sending the man crashing into the dirt, out cold before he even hit the ground. "Bind them. Gog them. Throw them in the trunks of their own cars," Tommy ordered his men, his voice devoid of any mercy. "We're taking a long ride out to the Salt Flats tonight. They've got a lot to answer for." Alexander watched in stunned silence as the 8 heavily armed cartel enforcers were swiftly disarmed, bound, and tossed into the vehicles like sacks of flour. The threat that had hung over his head for weeks was neutralized in a matter of seconds. With the cartel dealt with, the bikers brought their machines back out into the open. The threat was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of profound relief. Fiona emerged from the garage, tears of joy in her eyes as her uncle's men cheered her survival. Tommy walked back over to Alexander, pulling a thick envelope from his leather jacket. It was bulging with $100 bills. "For your trouble," Tommy said, offering it to the mechanic. "And for saving her life." Alexander looked at the money, then back at the giant biker. Slowly he shook his head, pushing the envelope away. "I didn't do it for a payout," Alexander said stubbornly. "I did it because she was broken, and I know how to fix broken things. You keep your money. I make my own living." Tommy stared at him, a deep sense of respect blossoming in his hard eyes. He tucked the money away. "You're a proud man, Alexander Carter. I respect that, but the Hells Angels do not leave debts unpaid." Tommy looked around the crumbling, impoverished garage. "You say you fix broken things. How are you with the Harley Evo engine?" Alexander crossed his arms, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I can rebuild a V-twin blindfolded with one hand tied behind my back." "Good," Tommy grinned, "because as of today, this garage is the exclusive, fully funded repair shop for the Nevada charters. We've got 300 bikes that need constant maintenance, custom paint, and parts. You're going to need to hire some help, Alexander. You're about to be a very rich, very busy man. And no one, and I mean no one, will ever disrespect this property again." "Oh, Mensayo." "Wow." Alexander looked at Fiona, who was smiling at him from the back of Tommy's motorcycle, finally safe, finally going home. The poor mechanic had risked everything to save a stranger in the dark. In return, he didn't just save a life. He earned an army of brothers and a completely new beginning in the unforgiving desert. As the sun began to set, painting the Nevada sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the 350 bikers fired up their engines. The roar was no longer terrifying to Alexander, it was the sound of salvation. If this intense, real-life story of sacrifice and unexpected twists grabbed your attention, hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this incredible tale with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more epic stories. What do Alexander think of Alexander's incredible courage? Drop a comment below